Hi, class. Welcome back to the second half of the 17th century. For the second half of the 17th century, we're going to be talking about Baroque painting in Northern Europe. So, basically, just talking about the two major regions of Northern Europe, the Dutch Republic and Flanders, a little bit of the Holy Roman Empire, and a little bit of Spain. If you remember at the end of our last lecture, I mentioned how I'm actually moving Diego Velázquez till the end of this chapter. So here's our map. It's pretty much the same map that we just left off with. I actually like the quality of this one a little bit better. You can see here we're talking about the region here, Flanders, which is pretty much modern-day Belgium, relatively pretty much modern-day Belgium, and then the Dutch Republic. You remember from our last chapter we talked about the 30 Years' War and the split that happens when the Dutch Republic breaks and gains religious independence from Spain. Spain owned basically all of what used to be Burgundy at a certain point, but the Dutch Republic wins the 30 Years' War, and they are, after the Treaty of Westphalia, they're officially their own country and their own entity. They're going to practice religious freedom, which for them meant the practice of Protestantism, primarily Lutheranism. It's actually going to get to the point, though, where they don't support religious freedom anymore, and they actually turn and start persecuting Christians, or Catholics, I should say. So it's sort of the irony of ironies. The Dutch Republic is going to start to do really well for themselves in this century. Once they gain their independence, it was a pretty big loss for Spain. The Dutch Republic has trading ties and commercial entities all over the world, and they start importing some of the hottest commodities, which at the time were things like tea from China, spices from India, eventually going to be into the sort of molasses and tobacco and nonsense and slave trade, which is an unfortunate element of it. But for the Dutch Republic, financially, they're going to be doing very well for this century. They even established the first bank in the Dutch Republic, which is interesting that it kind of took this long to establish a bank. It was very handy for them because they no longer needed to carry around a ton of money. They would just, send a letter and say, hey, wire this money into this account. And that way they're not carrying a bunch of cash with them. It's going to cut down on piracy. But the banking business is going to boom in the Dutch Republic, and they're going to make obviously a lot of money off of things like making a lot of money off of interest. Flanders, their poor pink cousins down here, are not going to be doing as financially successful. They don't have financial independence. They're not going to have the flourishing market that the Dutch Republic does have. However, they are being run by the Habsburg dynasty, so they have royalty living there. They're also going to be very Catholic, and so the art market is still going to flourish there, even though the rest of commerce and market may have been relatively slower than that of the Dutch Republic. So one of the major differences between Flanders and the Dutch Republic that you're going to notice right off the bat is a difference in patronage. Flanders is getting most of its patronage from Catholic church commissions, so you're going to see a lot of altarpieces, a lot of huge, very overtly Catholic scenes. It's going to be very reminiscent of what's going on in Italy, whereas the Dutch Republic is going to be getting most of its commissions from private patrons. And being as they're Protestant, they're not going to have a lot of large altarpieces. Hopefully you remember when we discussed iconoclasm. They're instead going to be more interested in portraiture. So there's a difference in patronage and a difference in the art that gets produced. Either way, though, lots of money being spent on the production of art, which is good for the artists. The first artist that we cover is Peter Paul Rubens, and he is from Antwerp, which at this point is located in Flanders. Actually, today still it's modern-day Belgium. So it's probably not a surprise that we're looking at a giant altarpiece. It's about 11 feet tall, approximately. It's a huge triptych. It would have been right over the altar of the Catholic Church in Antwerp. The scene itself is the raising of the cross. So this is the moment of crucifixion for Jesus Christ. So he's being lifted here. A lot of people don't know that about crucifying or crucifixions. And sometimes in movies they'll show crucifixions and they'll be hammering someone up to a cross that's already constructed. But that's not officially how they would do it. The Romans used to attach you to the cross while the cross was down, and then they would erect the cross, sort of move or lift lift it up and place it into a hole. So it would be sort of a doubly painful moment. First, the action of getting nailed down, and then the weight of your body as it's being pressed onto those wounds, which is another reason why the Romans would actually crucify you through your wrists, not your hands. Fun fact, because if they crucified you through your hands, it would just tear through as soon as your weight was put on it. So anyway, we have to talk a little bit about the dynamic composition that Rubens is incorporating here. We have a very strong diagonal composition coming down across across the playing field. So you can tell right away that we are looking at a Baroque piece. If this is a Renaissance piece, we would be looking at a very hierarchical or composed composition where the central figure is in the center. Yes, he's in the center, but everything is drawing our eye, instead of to the center, it's drawing our eye on this diagonal. Everything else in the composition is also helping to direct our eye down to Christ. We have these mysterious figures down here, onlookers, that bring our eye down. Then we have the gaze of this mysterious large-breasted woman in the front who's bringing us back up to Christ. Over here we have the Roman official, the Roman centurion on his really truly wild horse bringing us down, and then these rippling bodies of the figures bringing us back up. So everything is directing our eye to Christ, who's slightly off-centered, as I said, and then pulling us down along this diagonal. You can probably guess from the way that I said dynamic composition that we're looking at something that is very traditional in its Baroque style. You can also probably tell that it's Baroque because of the rippling muscles of these bodies in front, the figura serpentina of the figures. For example, this one right here, who's kneeling ever so almost awkwardly and kind of leaning into our space. Those rippling bodies that are reminiscent of the Laocoon, which you might remember. And of the emotion and exertion that's going on in this piece, also very typical of the Baroque. You have the onlookers cringing in fear, the centurion pointing in anger, the two thieves that are waiting up next, sort of worried with the anticipation of what's going to happen. And then you have all of this exertion. I mean, how many people are there? There's 1, 2, I always miss him. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people lifting this wooden cross with one man on top. It's overkill. It's drastic overkill. They would not have needed this many people to help lift this cross. And so the overkill, the drama, the theatricality of it, all definitely showing us that this is a very Baroque piece. Peter Paul Rubens and his work would fit very nicely with the Baroque style that's going on in Italy, especially the Carracci, Annibale Carracci's style, although you do see some use of tenebrism, so it's almost as if he's combining the two. Works like this are going to win Rubens a lot of fame and a lot of acclaim among all of the Catholic areas. He attracts the attention of Marie de Medici, who, despite her name, is actually not in Italy anymore. Marie de Medici goes on and marries the King of France, so it shows you how high the Medicis have risen. So she's the Queen of France, and she hires him to be the official court painter and court buyer, so he's in charge of buying paint for them. He surrounds himself with cronies, he surrounds himself with students and apprentices. He's so popular and he's such a powerhouse in the art world that it's really hard for us to tell where we're looking at something that was actually painted by Rubens or something that was more of a collaborative effort between him and his workshop, who would have been painting in the Rubens style, because he was that much of a sort of overwhelming force that he had people who learned to copy his style. This piece, because it is for his hometown of Antwerp and because it was done very early in his career, we're fairly certain is entirely Rubens, but for many of his later pieces, we're not always sure. We also see this Baroque love of complexity and also contrast in the straining muscles of the people who are exerting all of this force trying to lift Christ, and then the passive, almost complacent face of Christ who's staring up as if he's getting solace from the sky. Oh, also, this great solar eclipse that's happening up in the background. These are one of many pieces that Peter Paul Rubens painted for Marie de' Medici. This is her arriving in Marseille. This is her landing from Italy to the south of France, and then I guess she's going to take a horse and carriage up to Paris, where she'll get married to the king. France is celebrating her arrival in a swirl of pagan gods and goddesses, which is interesting. Down here we have all these sea nymphs heralding her arrival. Peter Paul Rubens, yes, he's going to do a lot of church commissions, but for his private commissions, he's going to stick with the actually Italian style of incorporating lots of myths and gods and stories from classical mythology. He also was supremely influenced by Ovid's Metamorphoses, which we talked about in our last lecture. Anthony van Dyck is an interesting character. Anthony van Dyck was an apprentice of Rubens. He knew how to paint in the Rubens style, but Rubens was casting a very large shadow in Flanders, and so Anthony van Dyck actually leaves Flanders. Actually, part of the reason was to get away from some of the tensions that had arose due to the 30 Years' War, and he goes to England, where he paints King Charles I of England. When he is in England, they are more of a Anglican faith, so not Catholic, and they're not going to have swirling reminders of the body of Christ the way that you do in the Catholic churches. Also, the patrons are a little bit less interested in mythology and heroics. Anthony van Dyck is certainly capturing Charles I's upper classishness. He's also capturing a sort of haughtiness, but he's not sitting there on a throne surrounded by, angels and trumpeters and whistling. He's just kind of relaxing and taking a break after his hunt. Anthony van Dyck's work, although technically part of the Flanders Baroque, would really be more at home with some of the things that were being produced in the Dutch Republic. So we're going to go there now. We're going to move from Flanders and our discussion of Rubens to a discussion of the art that's coming out of the Dutch Republic. Some of the cities that we're going to look at are Haarlem, Delft, Amsterdam, which is just starting to get on the map of importance. So in the Dutch Republic, despite the fact that they are Protestant, it does not mean that they're going to be completely devoid of religious paintings. They will still have some religious paintings in the Dutch Republic, and so this is one of them. But where they do have religious paintings, they tend to favor the more realistic of the portrayals, ones that don't emphasize too much of this drama or too much of angels floating in. They're not going to have a lot of halos. They just want to look at, regular everyday people acting out the scenes that they're so familiar with. So this is one example of the Calling of St. Matthew from the Dutch Republic, and there's no question about who St. Matthew is supposed to be in this one, and just a reminder or a compare and contrast between the drama and the sharp chiaroscuro known as tenebrism of Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew, also the obscurity of which one might be St. Matthew. Frans Hals was one of the most famous portrait artists coming out of the Dutch Republic. This is his image of called the Laughing Cavalier. I've also called it, or heard it called the Gay Cavalier, and it's sort of referred to in some occasions as the Dutch Mona Lisa, because he has such a captivating expression on his face. Portraiture in the Dutch Republic is going to be sort of a double-edged sword for many painters. It's kind of hard for many painters to try to capture it because the people in the Dutch Republic are going to be fantastically wealthy. Many of them have a ton of money coming in from trading and their merchant status or banking or all of the above. At the same time, though, they're now practicing a Protestant faith, and part of that Protestant faith was showing things like modesty and piety and simplicity and not letting the sort of worldly things get in your way. And so Frans Hals is trying to navigate that area, which could be very murky. He wants to show his cavalier, which, by the way, cavalier is a fancy word for a gentleman. So he's a gentleman. He wants to show his cavalier as having a lot of money, but he doesn't want to show him as being too showy about it. So he's wearing very nice clothes, but he has this look on his face as if he's above all of these worldly possessions. So that's how he tries to balance the two in his portraiture. From far away, when we see Franz Hals, what we get a sense of is a very true portrait, that he's really looking at this individual and studying his face for a long time and trying to capture it. The Dutch Republic, in their portraiture, they're really going to aim for almost a photorealism, because remember, there's no photography at this point, and they want to remember and they want their successors to remember what their faces looked like. So getting a true portrait, or being able to capture all of the pockets and colors and shades of a face, are very important. Franz Hals includes very realistic details, like this little area of light underneath his chin where the light's reflecting off of his very white collar that he's wearing. Also, Guy has a great mustache. So from far away, this looks like a very almost photorealistic piece. When you look up close, you can see, though, that Franz Hals is actually using a fairly rough brush stroke. When you look up close, you can see the strokes of his brush. When you get further away, you cannot. They love Franz Hals there. That's his grave. I think he was buried in Haarlem. Franz Hals also began to master the idea of the group portrait. That was another area where a lot of money could be made if you were an artist, because people wanted to be in portraits together to commemorate groups that they were in, clubs that they were in, and that kind of thing. So this is his portrait of the women regents of the old men's home at Haarlem. The women here are practically nuns. They're not technically nuns because they're Protestant, not Catholic. But they're practically nuns. They take care of the old men's home, so they are working all together, and they want to be seen in a portrait. Now, when Franz Hals would be painting a group portrait like this, he would not have had them all sit for him at the same time. That just wouldn't be practical. Who's watching the old men at the old men's home? So he would actually have, he would plan out the canvas ahead of time and have each one sit for him on an individual basis. So he would add them as he went. It was a pretty genius way of attacking what he perceived to be the problem of trying to get everyone in the portrait at the same time, and also have a life study to capture their realistic faces, but it always leaves the portrait looking somewhat posed, because it was, and it also makes it look somewhat artificial, again, because it was. Judith Leister was one of Franz Hals's students. She was another excellent portrait artist, and yes, she was a woman. If you go to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, you will see the next work of hers that we're going to study. But this is her self-portrait, so portrait artist here showing herself in a self-portrait. Similar to Franz Hals, she's a mastery of the complexities of the human face. She does a great job with that. She also does an excellent job with fabrics and minute details and that kind of thing. What's interesting about Judith Leister is that she was, as a woman, she was the first woman to be admitted to the Painters Guild in the Dutch Republic. So they invited her. Franz Hals probably vouched for her because she was his student, and they allowed her to paint in the Painters Guild. She was only really allowed to do portraits because of her status as a woman. So here you show her. She's similar to Katharina, if you remember from, I think it was 2 chapters ago, we talked about Katharina van Hemsten, and she had a portrait of herself painting someone else. Again, Judith Leister's painting a portrait of herself, painting a portrait of someone else, showing off the types of clientele that she could have. Must have been terribly uncomfortable to have to paint in all of these clothes, but she was a woman of good breeding, and so she would have had to make sure that she maintained the appearance of propriety, and that she wore all of her good clothes every time that she was painting. This is the piece that you'll see that's now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I hope that you do take a good long look at it, because it's a very interesting piece. She's showing 2 men having a nice time. It's called The Last Drop, because if you look here, you'll see that this individual in front has finished the last drop of his wine. Or his beer, sorry, I'm drinking beer. It was a favorite pastime among artists, especially among artists in the Artists Guild, to go out and have a good time after they had their guild meetings. And poor Judith Leister, as talented as she was, would not have been allowed at these after parties for the guild meetings because she was a woman. So it's possible that what she's showing here is somewhat moralizing of a tale. Like, they're having a nice time, they're drinking and smoking, but she also makes sure that she includes the skeleton, which is a good memento mori, also known as a reminder of death. He's holding a clock as if to say that, all of these pleasures fade. Judith Leister also does a pretty ingenious she uses a pretty ingenious technique here where she lights the painting from within the painting. We're used to seeing paintings that are lit from without, meaning that there's a light source shining from outside the canvas, lighting up the scene from the front. But here you can see that the areas actually facing us, like this shoulder, are in shadow, and the light's coming from this candle in the center of the scene.